So now that I've gone ahead and covered our civilization abilities, let's jump into the actual game and take a look step by step at what we're working with. So we have right here our two first units. We have a warrior represented on the tile by these burly men in what appear to be furs, all carrying clubs, and the settler, a bunch of guys with a pack mule. So the warrior, basic military unit because it's got a little rounded icon. That's how we know that it's a military unit, as compared to the settlers' more triangular or civilian icon. The warrior is used for engaging in combat and sort of defending your civilization. The way that you would actually activate this sort of trait of it, right, is you would just move onto a tile like so, and if there is an enemy in that tile, you'll automatically fight. Now that we've moved him, the warrior, his movement points are all used up, and now we have to do something with a settler. Now, if you remember, we need to settle on the coast because that's going to give us what we desperately need in terms of Australia's bonuses, right? It's going to activate for us that +3 housing in coastal cities. So if you look at the map, you see all of these little icons with what appear to be cityscapes and little advisor commentaries. This is basically the game recommending settlement locations for you. There's nothing wrong with choosing one of these, right? It's perfectly fine, but the way that you are going to handle this first initial turn really ties into your sort of gaming philosophy when it pertains to Civ 6. This is actually like an ongoing debate. A lot of people say, one half of the spectrum says, don't move your settler, right? Where you spawn, your initial location, that's where you settle. And a lot of people say, well, no, look around, see what there is. Now, the big advantage of this tile right here, right, if you look at its appeal, it is average, right? So that means we're not losing any bonuses for our Australian districts by settling here, right? Because it needs to be, in order for us to improve the yield of our districts, we need to have appeal of charming or better. So average, obviously this isn't a big competitor, whereas these hills are in fact charming. So we might want to save these for a district later on in the game. And also by settling here, even though if we hover over it and we see that those numbers at the very bottom, one production, 1 food, versus 2 production, 1 food, even though here we get this lower hex, even though we get less resources right off the bat, what we do get is immediate access to a source of copper, which, as you can see, very, very beneficial to have in your empire, and a source of mercury, which is in fact going to give us 1 science. So I would actually argue that it is better for us to move our settler here and then settle. And fantastic, we have now settled on the coast, and we have gotten our first Eureka, which are basically little boosts that you get to various technologies by performing certain predetermined actions. So now that we have settled and we have moved our warrior, there's nothing left for us to do but choose our research, which we will do right now. And mark. Alright, so now that we've settled our first city, the only thing that's really left for us to do here is to start planning out our production and our technology advancement. First things first, bottom right hand corner here, this big sort of blue vial filled with something. That's the game's prompt that we have a new technology that we can research. And when we click on it, this menu is going to pop up on the left with the research we've just completed at the top and our available options down below. Now what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to hit Open Technology Tree, and this is going to give us the bigger picture, right? And this lists all the technologies, the ones that are available to discover, unavailable, already discovered, with a handy little legend here. And as you can see, this stretches out for a long, long, long way into the future era, which are still undiscovered. Now, the thing that we're going to want to go ahead and do is sort of try to understand how our technology choice now is going to impact what technologies we hit in the future. So I think, right, remember, where we chose to settle was just slightly north. We chose to take the lower appeal tile that was going to be more immediately close to some key resources. And these resources, right, if you hover over them, it says requires mining, right? Mercury, luxury resource, requires mining. I am a firm believer in taking quick advantage of the resources that you have available. And so by virtue of that, I believe that we should go for mining. And these early technologies, they're not as pivotal in terms of like the impact that they will have later on, but they will decide the first couple of turns, right, how things go. If we do go for mining, that's going to open us up to masonry, bronzeworking, and the wheel, all three of which are excellent. And will be necessary sort of later on if we choose to build encampments, and if we choose to invest more in sort of like military defense. If we choose animal husbandry, it's going to be great. It's going to allow us to construct pastures, and it's going to allow us to see horses, which could potentially be useful, right, since we don't see any sources of cattle around right away, which means we can take advantage of the culture bomb effect. And if we go for pottery, that's going to open us up to irrigation, which leads nowhere, and writing, which leads us further into developing the sciences. Astrology gives us religion and celestial navigation later on. Celestial navigation gives us the harbor, which is going to be really nice for gold gain, and since we're right on the coast, it would make sense for us to build a harbor. And then sailing will allow us to make use of these little sea resources like crabs and turtles that we have down here. But I believe for now, for the first couple of turns, I'm going to hitch my horse to mining in order to take advantage of particularly mercury, which has a yield of 1 science. So now that we've selected that, let's go ahead and check what we can do in terms of production. There's a whole list of options here. These city center buildings are obviously buildings that would go in your city center. Right here, that's going to be this little hex for us under Canberra. We can also build builders. We can build, which are a civilian unit, right? Remember that little triangle. Scouts, warriors, and slingers, all of which, as we can tell by their circular icons, are military units. Now, slingers are an early ranged unit. They're relatively weak, but they can be upgraded into archers later on as we advance through the technologies. The warrior, right, as I've explained, that's sort of the baseline melee unit, and scouts are actually very interesting. They're a very weak melee unit, right? Warrior is 20, scouts is 10, right? So they're half the strength of a warrior, but they have a movement of 3, which means they're much faster, and they are used for exploring our surroundings. So I would actually recommend earlier on building a scout, because what we want to do is we want to know what kind of terrain is around us so that we know if we want to expand and where we want to expand to. We can sort of see the inklings of a desert down here, so that might be a good place for us to go. Deserts, especially later in the game, have some very nice key resources. We see more coast this way, no resources really to write home about. Neither is this way to the right, but we want to make sure of that.
Alright, so as you can see, this is not footage of the game. This is just an in-between slide type of deal. Basically, I'm going to summarize a little bit what happened and what our plan will be going forward. So as you saw, we settled on a lower appeal tile, right, as I mentioned in that introductory blurb, to give our campuses, commercial hubs, more space to grow. We didn't find any livestock initially, which is kind of a bummer, because that means that our ability that grants us culture bombs to increase our territory isn't going to be as effective, right? As I say there, land down under not functioning at maximum. That's basically what I mean, is that we're not making full use of our unique civilization ability. And for now, the focus is going to be to focus on exploring what's around us. That's why I chose to build that scout. And that's going to be our primary focus for the next couple of turns, because we need to find out what other resources are available to us, because the more cities we have on the coast, right, the more people overall in our empire, the more potential science, the more potential production, which is all going to contribute very nicely to our end goal of a science victory.